Last night was a historic moment. It was the very first Libertarian town hall that's ever been put on by a major news network. But unfortunately for lots of libertarians out there, our representative, Gary Johnson, completely dropped the ball. He did not do a good job representing libertarian philosophy. And so what I wanted to do was go through, hit the main questions, and try to answer exactly how a real libertarian might respond to the questions of the CNN town hall. Question number one.
The question that we hear most often in preparation for tonight is probably going to be the easiest for you to answer. Who is Gary Johnson, and what is a libertarian?
Okay, so I can't tell you about Gary Johnson, but I will tell you that what libertarianism is all about is maximizing human freedom and minimizing human coercion. Libertarians view individual freedom as a political end itself. What freedom is the absence of coercion. It's the absence of government. Now, what that means, practically speaking, when we're talking about policy, is that libertarians favor a minimal state. There are lots of different versions of libertarianism. You have extreme libertarianism and more moderate libertarianism. But universally, we want to diminish the role of government in individuals' lives. Economically speaking, that means we want less regulation, less taxes, less central oversight, less bureaucratic hoops to jump through in order for people to do business with one another. What that means, socially speaking, is we don't want a nanny state. We don't want the government to say who you can and cannot marry, what plants you can and cannot ingest for your own good, what firearms you can and cannot buy. In terms of how we want to craft a legal system, what libertarians say is, as long as it's peaceful, it should be legal. Even if I'm making decisions that might harm myself, as long as my actions don't hurt other people, it should be legal.
You said America would be safer if it was easier to buy guns and if more people carried them, especially out in public. But last week, when I went out dancing with my friends, unfortunately, I ended up in the middle of the worst mass shootings in our nation's history, and I'm still a little bit distraught about it. Yes. But what I did want to ask is, how would making it easier to buy guns with minimum requirements, especially unnecessary military rifles, how is that making it easier for us?
All right, so there are lots of different ways to answer this question. We can take a legal answer, we can give a theoretic answer, we can give an empirical answer. I'll just try to cover all of them really quickly. First, let's start with a matter of practicality. The common theme in all of these shootings is universally that they happen in gun-free zones, period. You have plenty of cases of mass shooting events that don't actually turn into full-on mass shooting events because you had either an armed policeman or an armed citizen stop the event in progress. It is practical, just purely practical, to have an armed public. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, but when you dig into the data, that's the case. The rate of gun ownership in the last 20 years has been skyrocketing, and the rate of violent deaths that are caused by guns has been plummeting. Now, theoretically speaking, again, this is a question about the appropriate relationship between citizens and the government. If it's the case that individuals are acting peacefully and they shoot firearms in their backyard or they carry firearms, but they don't hurt anybody else, the idea is it should be legal. You've not committed a crime until you've committed a crime, and it's not appropriate to have some central bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. say you can buy this, you can't buy that. And legally speaking, the argument is very clear. According to the Second Amendment, you have the right to keep and bear arms. There is, for good reason, a growing movement of LGBT gun supporters who think, look, frankly, even though we don't like the idea of guns, even though sometimes they might be scary, practically speaking and legally speaking, it makes sense that if we want to defend ourselves from aggression, we need to arm ourselves. It's a deterrent.
Well, when we look at that question, it takes you down the road of whether you see the Second Amendment as being open-ended or closed. Put some more meat on the bones of your position on this, because your baseline is, I don't believe in restrictions. I think that people should be able to exercise their Second Amendment right. But then you bring up mental health, and that gets tricky, because now you're dealing with super regulation, because unless it's an adjudicated mental illness, now you're dealing with really subjective measurements and real potential curtailment of rights. So how do you balance saying, I don't believe in restriction, but then being open to very serious restrictions?
Props to the moderator for calling Gary out on this, and quite frankly, it is contradictory. You can't be a libertarian and waffle on this issue. It is true to say that When you give over the power to government to determine who can and cannot get guns, that's a very slippery slope. Yes, superficially it makes sense. Oh, we don't want people with mental difficulties or with religious extremism to be able to get guns. But you have to think about it in terms of a principle. What qualifies as somebody that's mentally disturbed? Well, if that is a criteria that's being determined by people in government, that can be and will be abused. It has been abused throughout history. Do you really want a powerful central government who can determine which person qualifies in society as sane and insane? It doesn't take too much imagination to think, what if it happens where the criteria of sanity is determined by judging your own political views? Somebody might say, oh, look, Steve over there, he's this crazy radical libertarian anarchist, therefore he's on a list, therefore he doesn't get a gun. If you think that's some wild conspiracy theory, you got to read some history. This is how politics operates. And in practice, even this idea that somehow by creating more laws, it's going to be a deterrent against criminals who don't follow the law, I think is just catastrophically flawed. The tighter the rules, the tighter the regulations, the less resistance that criminals have when they get their firearms. Look at case after case of city after city and country after country that have crazy gun laws where when you have gun violence, it's a disaster. Chicago comes to mind. I was just reading a news report of in Germany. Apparently there was some guy came in armed with a rifle in a theater in Germany. How is that possible? Germany's got strong gun laws. Well, if I were living in a place that had very strict gun laws, I would be very worried about the people who are criminals that don't follow the law, thus having no resistance and no worry about brandishing their weapon and using it in a forceful way because they don't have to worry about it getting shot in the process.
All right, so there's a piece. Governor Johnson, right now you have a sit-in going on, at least right before we started. I don't know what the current status is. But do you agree with what is driving the sit-in by the congressman right now?
No, I think that these lists are subject to error, and if you're one of those error members, and I am talking now about the terrorist list or the no-fly list that has active members of Congress on both lists.
But you know those are a very small minority of cases.
Oh, absolutely.
And there is due process to deal with your being on a list.
Right.
Right, because the suggestion would be, you're wrongly on a list, we can deal with that. You get a gun when you're on one of those lists, now it's out of our hands.
This idea that it's okay to have a list out there of people that can fly and can't fly, that can get guns and can't get guns, at the discretion of the people in power is not a very sound principle, and I think it's a bit ignorant of history. This kind of gets at a bit of a deeper premise, which I'm sure will come out through some of the other questions, that people, I think, have too much faith in what governments can do. There's this idea of, oh, government has to keep us safe, and therefore it gets all of the responsibilities thereof. They should be able to break down anybody's door, go through any of their personal files, restrict them from any kind of behavior, just to make sure that the rest of us are safe. Well, if you allow governments to have that kind of power, your individual freedom is going to be greatly diminished, and your oppressor most likely is not going to be some stranger with a gun. It's going to be the government itself. Even in places like the Soviet Union that had maximal central control over the individual's life, they still had violence. You can't completely eradicate violence. And going down this path of give more power and more freedom to the government, allow them to make decisions for me, allow them to restrict the behavior of individuals that are acting peacefully, that is a road to unsuccessful disaster. Not only does it not keep people safe, but it takes away their freedom in the process.
But in the event that there's a fellow American who doesn't get health insurance or even opts out and then gets sick and can't afford the cost of the care that he needs to survive, is it really a libertarian principle that society should say he's made a choice, bears the consequences, and should be allowed to die?
No, it's not. But we have to be very, very careful in breaking down one of the premises of that question. The man asked, is it really a libertarian principle that society should do nothing? This is where libertarians go, whoa, 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 let's be very careful. Society and government are two very, very different things. You may have a moral responsibility to take care of your neighbor if he's in distress. Completely secondary question to whether or not we need to have the government tax people to forcefully administrate some kind of policy to have a social safety net that you ultimately can't opt out of. This way of thinking stretches very far back in the libertarian and classical liberal tradition, where we're very careful in saying society and government are not the same thing. They do not share the same responsibilities. And it's a very dangerous precedent to say they do. There's a very famous classical liberal called Frederick Bastiat. And he's a wonderful writer. And he said essentially, look, it's not fair to say that because I don't support the public funding for the arts, that therefore I'm against the arts. Or I don't support public funding for healthcare, therefore I'm against healthcare. That doesn't follow. It just means that those responsibilities should not be centralized, should not be in the world of politics and nonsensical mismanagement of resources. Those responsibilities rest with the individuals, with the communities, with those who voluntarily agree with the principles of a social safety net. And I'll take this one step further. Not only is society not government, but society exists despite the government. Everything that the government does is ultimately backed up by the use or threats of the use of force and violence. Even something like taxes. People think that you pay your taxes voluntarily. Well, not really. If you don't pay your taxes, then you get a letter in the mail that says, hey buddy, you better pay your taxes. If you keep refusing, you'll get people knocking at your door. You'll eventually wind up in jail. Everything that the government does is backed up by an implicit use of force. That is inherent. It is essential to the nature of government. In complete contrast to that, the essential nature of society and of civilization in general is peaceful interaction between individuals. It's the peaceability of social relations that is identical with civilization. And so if you view things that way, not only is society not the same thing as government, society is kind of the opposite as government. Government is the initiation and the threats of the use of force in society, and civilization is the peaceful interactions and shared ideas that emerge from a group of people that value individual freedom, that value peace, and therefore don't force each other to act in accordance with their own way of viewing the world.
Earlier today, House Speaker Paul Ryan unveiled the Republican plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. What would you do with Obamacare?
Throw it in the waste bin with all of the other outrageously terrible and counterproductive interventions in the private economy. People think for some reason in the United States that healthcare is this area which is completely unregulated and there's this wild free market that has failed. No, the most regulated, arguably the most regulated area in the U.S. economy is healthcare. Financial services is up there, but it is healthcare. And they've done a miserable job. Ever since Obamacare, my and my wife's premiums have been going through the roof to such a degree where I can't afford Obamacare. So what I'm doing is I have a private cost-sharing program that fortunately got an exemption from Obamacare, and my premiums are a fraction of what they otherwise would be because I can't afford it because of the outrageous stupidity of the regulations that come from Obamacare. And I won't dive into the economics of it now, but there's plenty of libertarian literature out there explaining exactly why Obamacare is such a train wreck.
As a libertarian, what do you view as the federal government's role in ensuring a woman's right to choose in every state?
This is an excellent question, and it gets at an internal disagreement that a lot of libertarians have. Does the government have a role in enforcing and protecting a woman's right to choose? You'll find plenty of libertarians saying yes. You'll find plenty of libertarians saying no. I have the perfect resolution for a presidential debate, and that is this. There are 300 million people plus that are living in the United States. It is silly to think that a one-size-fits-all solution is going to satisfy them all. Therefore, we have states for a reason. This is a state issue. Don't make this issue resolved from Washington, D.C. Have the individuals in the states that are trying to govern themselves decide this matter for themselves. In my own personal belief, no, I don't think that it is an appropriate use of governmental force to ensure that women can get certain medical procedures or not. I don't think that's an appropriate use of government.
Do you pray and do you believe in God?
Why don't you go to church?
What? You don't... What? Next question, please.
The presumptive Republican nominee has said that he wants to build a big, huge, very expensive wall on our border with Mexico. He also wants to deport 11 million undocumented residents. Do you agree with this plan? And if not, what do you plan to do to defuse this very emotional situation?
The idea of a gigantic wall separating two particular countries is not libertarian on several different levels. On the more metaphysical, philosophical side, libertarians, a lot of them have a very specific conception of borders, that when you really break down what borders are, they're kind of arbitrary. So this flavor of nationalism that's so strong in the United States about how superior America is to every other country in the world, and therefore all the inhabitants of those countries, they all wish they were Americans. That's not true, and it's not very sensible. Nobody was responsible for the geographical location in which they were born. Therefore, to have this superiority complex, I think, is a very bad way of thinking about political theory. Now, practically speaking, immigration is not actually that much of a problem. When you're talking about economics, there's very crystal clear reasons why immigration is a good thing for any domestic economy. However, where things get tricky and imprecise in my mind is to the extent that you have a government. We're not talking about anarchism here. To the extent that you have a government, it does make sense that there is some responsibility in determining who can and cannot enter your country legally. Now, it doesn't follow that, oh gosh, you gotta have a big wall to keep everybody out. No, but it does make sense that you would have something like health checks to make sure that people that you're bringing into the country don't have tuberculosis and other kind of diseases. So the proper libertarian position is very, very much pro-immigration for economic and moral reasons, that we view individual freedom as a political good itself, and it doesn't make sense that that should be restricted just to one group of people. Right? Individual freedom is good, whether it's in America, whether it's in Germany, it's in Mexico, everywhere around the world, individual political freedom is good. And when you put up gigantic border fences or have these outrageous rules for people trying to get into the country, that is a bad thing. We should maximize individual human freedom, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their background, regardless of what they're bringing to the table in terms of their belief systems. As long as they're peaceful, then they should be allowed to immigrate.
Governors, when one of my sons was 16 years old, he went out with some friends and he did a line of heroin. It did not end well for him. He became very sick and vomited. He aspirated and was left with brain damage so severe that now, 12 years later, he remains in a wheelchair with no ability to eat or speak, and he is fed through a tube in his stomach. His dad and I take 100% care of him. He has enough cognitive ability that he goes out with me and speaks at every forum where we are asked to go, a message about not doing drugs. We live in an extremely high-risk society, and this is normal for our children. So, governors, please explain to me how you think that legalizing marijuana straight through to heroin can possibly be a harm reduction forum. It makes no sense to me. And when you go out on the road with me, I can assure you that these young people say, can you people in positions of power please get rid of the drugs? We don't want to lose any more of our siblings or friends.
This question to me was probably the most interesting and maybe the most sad of all of the questions that were asked in the debate. And I really thought Gary did a poor job here. So there's a lot of things to break apart. First of all, the end of her question is, can you people in power please do something and get the drugs and get rid of the drugs? The answer to that is no. That's not the world we live in. And it's not a healthy way of conceiving what government can accomplish. Government can't just push a button and say all bad things are now illegal and therefore all bad things disappear, right? Murder is illegal, but murder is still around. So number one, we have to live in the real world where things aren't simply eliminated because we have the political will to do so or because legislation is written down and boof, therefore bad things disappear. Second of all, we live in the real world, which means we have to look at the real world consequences of prohibition. What this lady's talking about is prohibition. Just like in the 1920s, alcohol was prohibited, and with terrible results. You had the creation of Al Capone and a bunch of new murders and gangs that were revolved around people still supplying alcohol to people that wanted it. This lady's saying we should extend prohibition not just to marijuana, but to all the drugs. Practically speaking, for economic reasons and otherwise, this is not a good idea. Bad things happen the more you have prohibition. For one, prices go up. When prices go way up of any particular good, especially if we're talking about goods that are created now in black markets. That means people like gang leaders are going to have higher and higher profits. And the stakes go up and up. The more the government enforces drug laws and prohibition, the greater the incentive for nefarious people to supply those drugs to people who want them. And by virtually any objective metric, the drug war has been a catastrophic failure. Not just talking about the people that have the untold lives that have been ruined because of people getting put into the justice system and winding up in jail for so many years and then coming out and then going back to jail. Just talking about trying to accomplish what the drug war was trying to accomplish, it's a colossal failure, a huge waste of money. And then we get into the ethical side of it. And this is where libertarian philosophy is very clear. If people are acting peacefully, we should not lock them in a cage. We should not put them in prison. We should not charge them with crimes. So yes, if individuals want to use heroin, they should be educated and knowledgeable enough to make that decision for themselves. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but part of the reason for that is we don't have a healthy culture in America about understanding what drugs are and what they do. If you walk into virtually any gas station, you have alcohol on the shelves. Virtually anybody, teenagers included, can very easily drink themselves into death with alcohol. Alcohol does kill an insane amount of people. And you have very, very few arguments that people make for prohibiting alcohol. Just factually speaking, when harder drugs were decriminalized in places like Portugal and Zurich and apparently someplace in Canada, you have good results. You have drug uses and drug abuse go down. You have HIV rates go down. So this dystopian idea of, oh, if you legalize drugs, gosh, everybody's just going to be shooting up drugs. That, factually speaking, is not the case. Now, we could talk all day about the theory of it. That's what I love to talk about. We have lots of reason to believe that full legalization, yes, is the way to go. That is the libertarian ethical position. It's smart economics, and it is smart politics. And if you don't like drug crime and you don't like the idea of pouring an insane amount of money into the coffers of drug cartels, legalization is also the way to go.
Governor, if I may.
Go ahead. Please.
Sure.
That is not what I'm asking you. I'm not talking about people that are addicted. And when they go to your pretty little places with the pretty little needles, we're still going to have street people out selling heroin.
Exactly.
Because they're going to get their one dose and it's not enough. So you're keeping people addicted and you are not curing the fact that it is a sickness, it is an illness. And you are not addressing the young people that are so desensitized to what drugs are doing. And putting more drugs out there desensitizes them further.
We're not.
Now, partly to Gary's credit, it's true to say that the issue here with drug abuse is not the drugs themselves in almost all these cases. It's prohibition. It's what happens, practically speaking, when you make these things illegal is that when people buy drugs that they want, they have to buy them from shady people, and they don't know what kind of goods they're getting. They don't know whether or not their drug has been cut with some other thing. They don't know what the dosage is, and that's the reason that you get all these overdoses. Now, in every society, always, you're going to have people that are abusing drugs, and there's no way to get around that period. The real world is one which does not allow for the simple pushing of a button or the stroke of a pen by a politician to eradicate all death and disease in the world. That isn't the world we live in, and we need to be very particular and not necessarily swayed by the emotional stories of people that have died from drugs, because that is certainly heartbreaking. But when we're talking about crafting policy, we're talking about crafting political policy, it just doesn't follow that because bad things happen, we need government to intervene and say this is illegal and just hope that solves the problem. It doesn't work.
Maureen's referring to you being asked in the past, would the world be better off if all drugs were legal? And you answered yes.
And that's the correct answer, yes.
So as a previously enlisted Army Ranger who's deployed to the Middle East 6 times, I've seen firsthand the epic, wasteful amount of spending done in our global war on terror. I understand that if elected, Governor, your plan is to reduce the federal budget by 20% across all departments. So my question is, how do you balance maintaining the world's most dominant military force while attempting to eliminate wasteful spending?
This is another issue when there's a lot of disagreeing opinions on how extreme you want to go with the libertarianism. But I think Ron Paul had a good line here several years ago. I remember somebody asking him something similar, and he said, look, military spending does not equal more safety. Just spending more on the military does not equal spending more on defense. Military spending right now is spent crusading around the world, toppling dictators and trying to rebuild democracy in places that people don't want them. That costs an insane amount of money. So just practically speaking, yes, if we were to use government for, let's say, one of its appropriate roles, which I don't necessarily agree with, but let's say one of the appropriate roles of government is to provide for national defense. It does not follow, therefore, that all military spending is providing for national defense or practical individual defense, because we live in the real world where actions have consequences. And if you listen to virtually all of the rhetoric by Islamic radical terrorists, universally, they say the reason that this is happening is because what you did and do in the Middle East. The reason that we're bombing you is because you bombed us. Factually speaking, I don't think they're lying. That doesn't mean I'm sympathizing with them. That doesn't mean I think that's the right way to go about things. But I do think it makes sense if you want to reduce how much terrorism is in the world, and you want to save a lot of money in the process, and increase the amount of people's freedom in the world to peacefully trade with each other internationally, then you have to support reducing the military budget. Not to mention the incomprehensible degree of waste, fraud, and abuse that exists when we're talking about military spending. The Pentagon is so incompetent that it can't even keep track of how much money it loses. There are cases where the Pentagon literally loses track of like suitcases full of money that they just, I don't know what happened to it. Oops. Right? There's plenty and plenty of cases, binders full of cases of situations where the military spends an insane amount of money for tiny little things. And I will say, in my own political philosophy, I'm a radical libertarian, which means I don't even think there is a needed use for government at all. I think all of the services that government provides can be more efficiently and ethically provided by private entrepreneurs. That includes national defense, that includes police forces, and so on. So I do think if you go down the rabbit hole of more extreme libertarianism, this idea of national defense means something different when you don't have nations, when you don't have nation states. National defense looks a lot like individual private defense, looks a lot like community defense. But that's a topic I'll cover in other later videos.
Syria, Governor Weld brought up. Do you believe that there should be U.S. military intervention in Syria, given the context, which is without U.S. help, it does not seem that they can get it done?
There should not be military intervention in Syria, period. We can talk all day about the theoretical reasons why that's the case, or we can talk about the empirical reasons why that's the case. We have been fighting essentially on both sides of the war in Syria. We're trying to topple Assad, so we ally with the people who are trying to topple Assad. And those people happen to be ISIS, so we're funding them. But we're also fighting ISIS. It makes absolutely no sense, and it causes much more harm than good. Let's not involve ourselves in the internal affairs of other countries. Very, very sensible political idea, both ethically, economically, and practically.
Libertarians are seen as isolationists. You started off tonight by saying, we're going to redefine that, we're going to help you understand it, because that's not true. But where do you then see a role for U.S. military in the world on all the various theaters right now where we're involved?
Again, questions like this evoke this idea of United States nationalism, that, gosh, just without us, the world would fall apart. We have to keep everything together and be the world's policemen, otherwise the bad guys will take over. I think this is nonsense. I think a lot of libertarians think this is nonsense. To the extent that we have a central government that is to protect our national defense, it does not follow at all that we need to be involved in all of the different affairs of countries around the globe. If we're going to have a strong national defense, that means not getting involved and making a bunch of enemies overseas. Another way to put this is, let's keep our damn hands to ourselves.
But just one follow on that. If you believe that the United States should use military force to respond when attacked, and you say constructively we have been attacked by ISIS, then how can you not be involved in Syria, which is obviously a big swath of the Levant where ISIS has its stronghold? How do you stay out of there?
This, I thought, was another sort of good answer by Johnson, where he's saying, look, what do you mean? We're fighting ISIS and we're supporting ISIS in the nonsense in the Middle East at the same time. So when you say, do we need to get involved in Syria? What do you mean, do we need to get involved in Syria? Do we need to be on the side of Assad? Is that what you're arguing? Again, just because somebody attacks us doesn't mean that indiscriminately we're going to find some country somewhere where we can invade, overthrow their government, and say, oh good, look, we're fighting the war on terror. That doesn't follow.
Both of the major party candidates have embraced a protectionist, anti-free trade policy. Tell us why supporting free trade benefits American businesses and American consumers.
This is the most softball question of the whole thing. Like, tell us about why free enterprise works. And Gary again kind of dropped it. I mean, he looked around, he was like, well, I mean, do you want to talk about this? Like, what? This is the bread and butter of libertarianism as far as I'm concerned. Like, why does free trade work? Well, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I will give you some references, right? Check out some of the work that's at fee.org, the Foundation for Economic Education. They have a huge library that's available if people want to learn how do free markets work. Well, you have to understand some central concepts like the division of labor, which essentially says, look, different people specialize in different areas and then they trade with each other, and that's a good thing. You have to understand what happens practically speaking when government intervenes with wage and price controls. I encourage anybody to look at some charts of national GDPs in relation to the relative freedom of those countries, and it's pretty much a direct linear relationship. The more economically free, the more wealth creation. And when you understand why, it's this incredible principle for understanding how the world works. When you have a grasp of economics and you get why competition is a good thing, why regulation is universally a bad thing, then it is this lens through which you can see the world with remarkable clarity.
Everybody is saying jobs, jobs, jobs in the election right now. Nobody is saying how. When you say that, because look, trade goes away as an issue of a problem if you're generating good jobs at home. You just said that. How do you generate good jobs in the United States?
You don't. This is one of the principles you learn when you start understanding economics. And this is what so many people don't understand when they think about the government's relationship to the economy. Government does not create jobs. At best, it destroys them and destroys wealth. The way that jobs are created is by the absence of government intervention enables entrepreneurs to go out and hire people to try to create value for society. In the process of creating value for society, those entrepreneurs make money. So from a policy perspective, the way that you create jobs as a president is absolutely crystal clear. You get the bureaucrats out of the way. You turn off Washington, D.C. You allow entrepreneurs to create value and create jobs because that's what they do. All of the jobs that are created by government, good heavens, all of them are financed through taxation, which means when you have taxes, you don't have a functioning profit and loss system. This is why you have incredible inefficiency in bureaucracy, because you don't have prices, you don't have profits, you don't have losses that work effectively. That's not the case in the private marketplace, and I absolutely guarantee you all that is necessary to reinvigorate the economy is for government to do less. The problem, politically speaking, is it's much easier to say, vote for me and I'll have a jobs program and I'll put you to work. People like hearing that kind of rhetoric, but unfortunately that's just economically not how it works. It doesn't have the same ring to it like, vote for me and I'll allow you to create the jobs. It's the individuals in the economy creating the jobs. It's not the politicians. That doesn't have the same ring to it, unfortunately, and that's why the economy is in the debacle that it's in.
But the devil's a little bit in the details, Governor, if you want to address this part of it. The big problem with doing what you're doing is you wind up cutting the amount of revenues that government has to work
No,
on.
actually, it's revenue neutral. The whole proposal.
That's not so, according to economists, that's not so easy to achieve.
Well, maybe not.
Because you're doing, why? Just to give you the context, why? If you say the fair tax number that's usually thrown out is 28%, this would be your consumption tax. So you're automatically reducing the 39% from the top level down. That creates an issue about how you want to distribute the tax burden.
You're getting a little too into the weeds.
You think
here.
so?
Yeah,
but I think it matters to people because the idea can sound really good, one tax.
Exactly.
But you're also cutting your revenues in half, so how's your government provide the services?
No.
Again, how Gary missed this kills me. It needs to be absolutely crystal clear. Libertarians want a smaller government. We don't want these things to be revenue neutral. There's way too much revenue that's going into the coffers of government, which they all spend and burn and probably would be better used flushed down the toilet. We don't need a 20% reduction in the government. We need like an 80-90% plus reduction in government spending. So the idea that, only taking 28% on a consumption tax of what people make, only taking 28%, gosh, how would you provide for the services? Well, if the services that the government is incompetently providing, if those services go away, and heaven forbid we don't have the Department of Education, we don't have these outrageous, inefficient departments, then you don't need to bring in nearly as much. That was such a missed opportunity. Now, This is also directly related to the jobs issue, right? When you have entrepreneurs that are trying desperately to employ people and make a profit and serve society, and in the process of serving society, making a profit, when they're trying to do that and they lose half of their income to the government, they have a very strong incentive to say, screw it, I'm not going to work so hard, I'm not going to create as many jobs. These schmucks in Washington, D.C. are just going to take my money and run away with it and burn it. Well, in the process of reducing government spending, in that process, and reducing taxes, you incentivize people to work more because they can keep more of what they legitimately earn. It's probably fair to say that to the extent government grows, the economy shrinks.
My question is, it has been repeatedly stated by numerous libertarian candidates in the media that they respect but do not endorse the Black Lives Matter movement. Others have said that they do not support the movement for Black lives entirely. Where do you stand on supporting, protecting, and upholding the human and civil rights of Black people and people of African descent in the United States and across the diaspora? Thank you.
Libertarianism is by far the most radical, individualist political philosophy that you're ever going to encounter. Part of the problems that are caused in society and by government comes from what's called collectivism. It comes from putting people into groups based on some particular identity, where it's their skin color, their religious beliefs, whatever. Libertarians and individualists don't view the world this way. We view the world through the lens that everybody is absolutely equal under the law, regardless of any biological composition that they have. So in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, yes, Black Lives Matter, and it's not and white lives matter, and these lives matter, and those, it's everybody is an individual, and as such should be treated equally from the perspective of government. People, especially on the left, love to put people into groups. They say, oh, well, Steve, you're just a white man saying this. They say, oh, libertarians are white people, or there's some socioeconomic thing, and you're part of this socioeconomic group. Libertarians should balk at this idea. We need to view people as individuals. When we're talking about political structures, you can't have special exceptions that are made for anybody, whether they're minorities or majorities. And again, this is not just theoretical speculation, right? Empirically speaking, the damage that is caused to Black communities and minority communities, almost all of it comes back to government. This was the case prior to the Civil Rights Movement, right? The Jim Crow laws were laws, right? The Dred Scott case was a situation where the government said a freed slave has to be sent back to the plantation. This is government laws in the first place. A huge amount, if not the vast majority, of the unequal treatment of Blacks and whites in the United States comes directly from the drug war. And if you decriminalize and legalize drugs, then you're not going to have the kind of systemic discrimination that happens in the legal system, specifically because it affects minorities much more than it does the white population.
Governor, in your opinion, what do you feel is the greatest challenge facing our country's next president?
Now, this is my own thought. I can't speak for all libertarians, but I think the greatest threat that is facing America, and indeed countries all over the globe, is purely intellectual. It's the state of our educational status in the United States. People don't understand how free markets work, and they have this boogeyman idea of how wealth gets created. They don't understand historically how dangerous strong central governments are. And in fact, it's not even that they don't understand them, it's that they actively have been anti-educated. So not only do people not understand how markets work, they don't want markets. They think markets are a bad thing. This is a very dangerous precedent, and it's how you get dictatorships, it's how you get socialism, which has a miserable track record in terms of creating more and more poverty, death, and destruction in the world. The freer that people are, historically speaking, and certainly theoretically speaking, the freer people are, the more peace and prosperity they have. And the more central control that comes from government trying to micromanage people's lives, the more misery and poverty comes. And so I'm afraid the current state of the American electorate in terms of how they understand the world is so fantastically inaccurate, where they don't even conceive of issues the correct way. And because of that, I'm pretty pessimistic when it comes to the long-term future political status of U.S. citizens. I just think because we have a representative democracy, it means that when you have mass uneducation, you're going to get really ugly political results. And I think we're seeing that in this election cycle. All right, so those are my responses. I hope you enjoyed them. The ideas coming from a real libertarian. Of course, there were other questions that I skipped over, but if you want to know more stuff, if you enjoyed this, leave a comment, let's talk about it. And if you're interested in big ideas, not just political ideas, but big philosophic ideas in general, check out the rest of my stuff on my channel. Subscribe. I also have a podcast that I'm running that you probably like. It's called Patterson in Pursuit, where I'm talking with intellectuals and philosophers, political theorists, and economics all around the globe about big ideas, big foundational ideas, so we can try to clearly understand what we're talking about and have a more accurate and clear worldview. Thanks for watching.